What if everything you believed was wrong? What if the gods you worshipped never answered? This is the story of a farmer who became a king, a father who lost everything, a warrior who dared to question fate itself. Ragnar Lothbrok did not just conquer lands, he challenged destiny, defied tradition, and stared into the eyes of death without fear. But here's the truth no one tells you. Ragnar didn't fall because of his enemies. He fell because of who he became. We begin, not with thunder, nor with kings, but with soil beneath the fingernails of a man history almost forgot. Ragnar Lothbrok was not born into legend. He did not inherit power. He did not command armies. He was a farmer, a man who rose with the sun, who toiled the earth, who lived a life already written for him long before he took his first breath. In Kattegat, the rhythm of existence was predictable. Men sailed east, raided familiar lands, returned with silver, and repeated the cycle until death claimed them. It was not a life of failure, but it was a life without question. And Ragnar questioned everything. There was something restless within him, something that refused to be silenced. While others saw the horizon as an end, Ragnar saw it as a beginning. What lies beyond? It was a simple thought, but in a world bound by tradition, it was nothing short of rebellion. Because to challenge the direction of the ships was to challenge the wisdom of generations. To challenge the wisdom of generations was to challenge the will of the gods. And yet, Ragnar did not stop. He listened. He observed. He imagined. Where others followed, he calculated. Where others obeyed, he wondered. This was not arrogance. This was vision. A dangerous kind of vision, the kind that isolates a man before it elevates him. And in that isolation, Ragnar found an unlikely ally. Floki, a shipbuilder, a dreamer, a man just as unbound by limits as Ragnar himself. Together, they did not simply build a vessel, they built defiance. A ship unlike any other. One that could cut through waves no Viking dared cross. One that could carry men into waters the world had not yet named. The West. An idea dismissed by many, mocked by most, feared by all. But Ragnar believed. Not because he had proof, but because he refused to accept that the world ended where others said it did. And so, he made a choice. Not as a warrior, not as a leader, but as a man standing at the edge of the unknown. To leave behind certainty for possibility. To abandon tradition for truth. And in that moment, quiet, unseen, almost insignificant, Ragnar Lothbrok did something that would echo through history. He chose the path no one else dared to walk. Because greatness is never born in comfort. It is born the moment a man looks at the life given to him and decides it is not enough. And from that moment forward, Ragnar was no longer just a farmer. He became a force, moving against the current of the world itself. The sea did not welcome Ragnar. It tested him. Waves rose like walls. Winds howled like something ancient and unforgiving. The men aboard that ship, men who had spent their lives sailing familiar waters, now found themselves staring into something vast and unknowable. Some prayed, some doubted, but Ragnar stood still. Not because he was fearless, but because he had already crossed the point of return, and that is the thing about choosing the unknown. Once you take that step, you cannot go back to who you were. Days passed. Food ran thin. The horizon remained empty. And then, land. Not imagined, not hoped for. Real. Green fields. Stone structures. A coastline untouched by Viking hands. England. And in that moment, everything changed. Because Ragnar did not just find land. He proved that the world was larger than tradition allowed. The first raid was swift. A monastery, silent, defenseless. The monks did not fight. They did not understand. Gold was taken. Lives were spared at first. But something deeper happened that day. Ragnar realized something most warriors never do. Power does not come from strength alone. It comes from knowledge and surprise. When he returned to Kattegat, he did not come back as a dreamer. He came back with proof. Silver, stories, evidence. And proof is far more dangerous than belief, because belief can be ignored. But proof forces change. Yet change is never welcomed by those who rule. Earl Haraldsson saw it immediately. Not the gold, not the success, but the threat. Ragnar had done something no one else had dared, and worse, he had succeeded. That meant one thing. The old way was no longer the only way. And if that truth spread, Haraldsson's power would crumble. So he did what all threatened rulers do. He resisted. At first, subtly, dismissing Ragnar, undermining him, watching him. But Ragnar was no longer just a farmer. He had seen the world beyond. And once you see beyond limits, you cannot pretend they exist anymore. The tension grew. Two men, two visions. One clinging to control, the other driven by possibility. And eventually, conflict became inevitable. Their confrontation was not just about power, it was about the future. Steel met steel, not in chaos but in clarity. Ragnar did not fight with rage. He fought with precision. Every movement deliberate. Every strike controlled. Because this was not just survival. This was transformation. And when Haraldsson fell, so did the old world. Ragnar became Earl. But power is never the end of the story. It is the beginning of a different kind of battle. At first, Ragnar ruled differently. He did not close himself off. He listened. He learned. He adapted. He continued to sail west, not out of rebellion anymore, but out of purpose. And with each journey, his legend grew. Not just among his people, but among his enemies. In England, Ragnar encountered something unexpected. Not weakness, but intelligence. King Egbert of Wessex was unlike the men Ragnar had faced before. He was thoughtful, calculated, curious. And for the first time, Ragnar met someone who reflected his own mind. Their conversations were not of swords, but of ideas. Faith, power, legacy. Ragnar did not mock their beliefs. He questioned them. He listened. He absorbed. Because Ragnar was never driven by hatred. He was driven by understanding. And that made him unpredictable. Because a man who understands his enemy can become something far more dangerous than a warrior. He becomes a strategist. But while Ragnar expanded outward, something inside him began to shift. Success brings clarity, but it also brings hunger. The hunger to go further, to become more, to leave something behind that cannot be forgotten. And, slowly, ambition began to change shape. What once was curiosity became necessity. What once was vision became expectation. And the higher Ragnar climbed, the further he moved from the man who once stood alone on that shore, asking what lay beyond. Because here is the truth no one speaks of. The path to greatness does not just build you, it reshapes you, and not always into something you recognize. Ragnar had conquered distance. He had defeated power. He had proven himself right. But a new question now stood before him. Not about the world, but about himself. And he did not yet realize it. But the greatest battle he would ever face had already begun. The higher Ragnar climbed, the quieter his victories became. Not because they meant less, but because they began to cost more. At the height of his power, Ragnar Lothbrok had everything a man could claim. Land, wealth, a name spoken with both fear and respect. He had become exactly what he once set out to be. And yet, something was missing. Not in the world around him, but within him. Because ambition does not end when you succeed. It evolves. What once pushed Ragnar forward, curiosity, wonder, the desire to discover, slowly began to change. It hardened. It sharpened. It demanded more. More victories. More control. More legacy. And that is where the fracture began. At the center of Ragnar's life stood Lagertha. Not just his wife, but his equal. She had fought beside him, built with him, believed in him before anyone else did. She was there when he was nothing. And yet, she would not be there when he became everything. Because Ragnar made a choice. Not out of love, but out of fear. The fear that his legacy would not be enough. The fear that one son was not enough. So he chose Aslaug, a woman tied to prophecy, to destiny, to something greater than love. And in doing so, Ragnar did something many great men do. He sacrificed what was real for what might be. Lagertha left, not with anger, not with weakness, but with dignity. And Ragnar, though he would never say it, lost something he would never recover. From that moment forward, his victories began to feel different, louder, bigger, but emptier. His sons grew. Bjorn strong, fearless, searching for his own path. Ivar brilliant, dangerous, unpredictable. Each carrying a piece of Ragnar, but none fully understanding him. Because Ragnar himself was beginning to drift. Then came Paris. Not a village, not a monastery, a fortress. A symbol of power beyond anything Ragnar had faced. Stone walls that touched the sky, defenses built not for men but for empires. And Ragnar chose to attack it. Not because it was easy, but because it was impossible. Because somewhere along the way, Ragnar stopped chasing opportunity and started chasing greatness itself. The assault was brutal. Arrows darkened the sky. Men fell before they reached the walls. Boiling oil, collapsing ladders, screams carried through smoke and fire. For the first time, Ragnar was not the storm. He was the one being resisted. Yet even then, he refused to fail. He adapted. He waited. And then, he deceived, feigning death, allowing himself to be carried inside the gates of Paris. A risk so extreme, it bordered on madness. And for a moment, it worked. The gates opened, the city trembled. The legend of Ragnar grew even larger. But this was not victory. Not truly. Because Ragnar did not conquer Paris, he touched it and was pushed back. And that was enough. Enough to plant doubt. Because Ragnar was not afraid of losing battles. He was afraid of losing control. And Paris showed him something he had never faced before. Limits. Not imposed by others, but real. Unavoidable. After Paris, Ragnar disappeared. No grand farewell. No explanation. He simply vanished. And when he returned, he was no longer the man who left. Time had changed him. His body slower. His eyes heavier. His presence fractured. The man who once stood unshaken before storms, now struggled against himself. He turned to opium. Not for pleasure, but for silence. For escape. For relief from something he could not name. Because the greatest battles are never fought with swords. They are fought within. The people who once followed him now questioned him. The sons who once looked up to him now looked past him. The legend remained. But the man behind it was fading. And perhaps the most dangerous change of all was not his weakness. It was his doubt. Not in his strength. Not in his enemies. But in the very thing that once guided him, the gods. For years, Ragnar had asked questions. Now, he stopped waiting for answers. Because none ever came. No sign. No voice. No certainty. Only silence. And in that silence, Ragnar began to understand something terrifying: that he had always been alone. And when a man who once believed in fate stops believing in anything at all, he does not become weaker, he becomes free. But freedom, without purpose, is just another kind of prison. Ragnar had conquered lands. He had defeated kings. He had changed the course of his world. But now, he stood at the edge of something far more dangerous than any battlefield. Not the unknown of the sea, but the unknown within himself. And for the first time in his life, Ragnar Lothbrok did not ask, "What lies beyond?" He asked, "What have I become?" Ragnar Lothbrok once stood before the world and asked what lay beyond it. Now, he stood before himself and had no answer left to give. The silence that followed him was different. Not the silence of the sea, not the silence of the gods, but the silence of a man who had nothing left inside. He returned to Kattegat not as a conqueror, but as a reminder of what greatness becomes. When it burns too long, the people did not cheer. They watched, carefully, quietly, because legends are easy to admire until they begin to fade. His sons stood before him, no longer boys, no longer shadows of him. They had become something else, something sharper, something harder. Bjorn looked at him and saw strength that had weakened. Ivar looked at him and saw a mind that had fractured, but neither of them saw the truth. That Ragnar was not broken. He was finished. There is a moment in every man's life when he understands that he is no longer the future. And Ragnar understood. He did not try to reclaim power, did not raise an army, did not even defend his name, because for the first time, he was not driven by ambition, he was driven by clarity. And clarity is far more dangerous than ambition. So he made a choice, not to survive, but to conclude. He gathered only a few men, not warriors, not followers, just witnesses, and he sailed again, not toward discovery, but toward consequence. The sea was calm this time. No storm, no resistance. Because the battle was no longer outside him, it was already over. Ragnar sat at the front of the ship, but he did not look ahead. He looked down, at his hands, at the scars, at everything he had built, and everything he had destroyed. Because in the end, the cost of becoming legend is becoming alone. England awaited him, not as a mystery this time, but as a destination. He did not fight, did not run, did not resist. He walked forward and allowed himself to be taken. King Aelle saw a man without power, without army, without purpose. He saw weakness. Ragnar saw something else. Completion. They dragged him through the mud, stripped him of dignity, displayed him like a relic of a story that had already ended. And Ragnar let it happen. Because dignity was never the point. Meaning was, when they stood him before Aelle, there was no fear in his eyes, only understanding. Because Ragnar had already faced the only thing that could defeat him, himself. They demanded answers. About gods. About faith. About fear. And Ragnar answered, with something far more dangerous than belief. Truth. I have never seen the gods. The room fell still, because belief gives people comfort, but truth removes it, and Ragnar no longer needed comfort. When they threw him into the pit, it was meant to be an ending, a punishment, a slow, painful death. Darkness closed in, cold stone beneath him, snakes moving in silent patterns around his body. At first, nothing. Then, the bites. Sharp, sudden, unavoidable. Pain spread through him like fire. But Ragnar did not resist. Because resistance belongs to men who still want to live. And Ragnar had already let go of that. Instead, he chose something else. He chose to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, but deliberately. Each word placed like a weapon, not for the present, but for what would come after. My sons will hear of this. And in that moment, the story changed. Because Ragnar was no longer a man facing death, he was a man creating consequence. Every wound, every bite, every moment of suffering became part of something larger. A message, a spark, a beginning. His breathing slowed. Vision dimmed. The world around him faded into shadow. But his mind remained clear, clearer than it had ever been. Because for the first time in his life, Ragnar was not searching, not questioning, not reaching. He simply understood that everything he had done, every choice, every loss, every victory, had led him here. Not to failure, to purpose. And as the darkness finally closed around him, Ragnar Lothbrok did not die as a king, did not die as a warrior. He died as something far more powerful. A story. And stories do not end in pits. They spread. They grow. They return. And somewhere far from that darkness, his sons were still alive. And when they heard what had been done to him, the world would feel it. Because Ragnar Lothbrok did not need to survive. To win, Ragnar Lothbrok was gone. No final battle. No grand victory. Just a body, left in darkness. And, for a moment, the world continued, as if nothing had changed. The wind still moved across the sea. The kingdoms still stood. Men still lived and died, as they always had. But stories do not end where bodies fall. Far from that pit, far from the silence that claimed him, there were ears waiting. His sons. When the news reached them, it did not arrive as words. It arrived as fire. Bjorn did not speak. He stood still. His jaw tightened. His eyes sharpened. Because in that moment, he understood something Ragnar had always known. That the world does not remember weakness. It remembers response. Ivar reacted differently. Not with silence, but with intensity. His body tense. His mind racing. Not just anger, but calculation. Because where Bjorn carried Ragnar's strength, Ivar carried something else. His unpredictability. And together, they became something Ragnar never was. Not a man, but a force. The great heathen army did not rise out of ambition. It rose out of consequence. Ships gathered. Warriors answered. Not for gold, not for land, but for something deeper. A name. Ragnar. England would feel it first. Villages burned. Armies fell. Kings were forced to face something they did not understand. This was not invasion. This was inheritance. Everything Ragnar had started was now continuing without him. King Aelle, the man who believed he had ended Ragnar's story, now stood at the center of something far greater than himself. And when they found him, there was no negotiation, no mercy, no hesitation, because Ragnar had already decided his fate, and his sons were simply carrying it out. Aelle died, not as a king, but as a consequence, and with him, the illusion of control, because what Ragnar truly created was not conquest. It was momentum, a shift, a fracture in the way the world understood power. Before Ragnar, Men followed the path given to them. After Ragnar, men began to question it. And that is his real legacy. Not the battles, not the victories, not even the revenge, but the idea that limits are not real, that the horizon is not an ending, but a question, and that question still exists. Ragnar Lothbrok was not a perfect man. He made choices that cost him everything: love, family, himself. But he did something very few ever do. He changed the direction of his life and forced the world to change with him. And in doing so, he became something more than a king, more than a warrior, a symbol of ambition, of rebellion, of consequence. Because Ragnar's story is not about Vikings. It is about something far closer to us. The part of you that wonders if there is more. The part of you that questions the life you were given. The part of you that stands at the edge and hesitates. Ragnar did not hesitate. He stepped forward. And yes, it destroyed him. But it also made him unforgettable. And that is the paradox. Greatness always comes with a cost. The question is, are you willing to pay it? Because history does not remember those who stayed safe. It remembers those who moved. And Ragnar Lothbrok moved first. Now, the story is no longer his. It's yours. The sea is still there, unchanged, endless, just as it was when a farmer once stood at its edge and asked a question no one else dared to ask. What lies beyond? Ragnar Lothbrok is gone, but that question never left, because it was never about him. It was about something far more dangerous. The moment a man begins to question the life he was given, and maybe that moment is closer than you think. Right now, you're standing at your own horizon, not of oceans, not of kingdoms, but of choices. Stay where it's safe. Follow what's known. Live the life that was already written for you. Or step forward into something uncertain, uncomfortable, unforgiving, just like Ragnar did. And yes, it may cost you. It may take things from you. It may break parts of you you didn't know could break, but it will give you something in return. A story that is yours. Because, in the end, no one remembers the ones who stayed behind. They remember the ones who moved. So the only question left is, what will you do when you reach your edge? If this story made you feel something, if it made you think, if it made you question your own path, then don't let it end here. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and step into more stories that don't just entertain, but change the way you see the world. Because the next legend might be yours.